It started with a seemingly routine traffic stop on a quiet suburban street. A black man in a sleek, black sedan was pulled over by a patrol officer, who claimed he had failed to signal a turn. The man, calm and composed, rolled down his window and handed over his license and registration without a word. Yet, even in his silence, there was an air of authority about him, something unshakable in his demeanor. The officer, however, didn't notice, or perhaps refused to notice. Instead, he saw what he wanted to see, a black man in a nice car, and that alone was enough to ignite his prejudice. The tension between them grew thick, suffocating, as the officer's words turned sharper, his tone more accusatory. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" the officer barked, his hands resting heavily on the edge of the car door, his body leaning in too close. The man nodded slightly. "You said I didn't signal. Is that correct?" His voice was steady, polite, but firm, as if he were trying to diffuse a situation that didn't need to exist. But the officer's aggression only escalated. "License and registration don't mean a damn thing if you're hiding something. Step out of the car." There was a beat of silence, heavy and loaded. The man hesitated, not out of guilt, but because he knew where this was heading. He had seen it too many times before, the abuse of power, the unnecessary escalation, the humiliation. "Officer," he said carefully, "I've complied with your request. What seems to be the issue?" The officer's patience snapped like a dry twig. "I said get out of the car. Now." As the man stepped out, his tailored suit and polished demeanor only seemed to provoke the officer further. His voice was filled with indignation, but not fear, and that seemed to irritate the officer even more. "Do you treat everyone like this, or just the ones who look like me?" That was the spark. The officer's face twisted with rage as he shoved the man against the hood of the car. People started to gather, some recording on their phones. "Shut your mouth," the officer shouted. "You think you're better than me? You think your fancy suit and your attitude mean you can disrespect me?" The man's words were clipped, his voice strained as he tried to remain calm despite the humiliation. "I haven't disrespected you. I've done everything you've asked." But the officer wasn't listening anymore. He raised his fist and struck the man across the face. Gasps rippled through the growing crowd, and the phones capturing the scene tilted slightly as onlookers recoiled in shock. And then, the man spoke, his voice low but cutting, even as blood trickled from the corner of his mouth. "Do you even know who I am?" The officer laughed mockingly, his chest puffed out as he surveyed the man he had just humiliated. "Yeah, I know exactly who you are. You're a nobody. Just another thug who got too big for his boots." But as the man straightened, his gaze unwavering and sharp, something in the air shifted. There was no anger in his eyes, only an unsettling calm that seemed to unnerve even the officer for a moment. He adjusted his suit jacket, smoothed his tie, and let the silence linger just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. "No," the man said, his voice unwavering. "I'm the director of the FBI." The words hit like a thunderclap. The officer's smirk faltered, his confidence draining from his face in an instant. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, a mix of disbelief and outrage. Phones zoomed in, capturing every micro-expression on the officer's face as realization set in. He had just assaulted one of the most powerful men in the country, someone who could dismantle his entire career with a single phone call. But the director didn't make that call. Not then. Instead, he stared at the officer for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before turning to the crowd. "Make sure you send me those videos," he said calmly. Then, he got back into his car and drove away, leaving the officer standing there, pale and stunned, as the weight of his actions began to crush him. What happened next would leave the entire nation speechless. Because while the director may have driven away that day, he wasn't done. The ripple effects of that single act of racism and violence would expose a web of corruption, spark a national conversation about systemic racism, and lead to consequences the officer could never have imagined. How does a man who represents justice respond when justice is denied to him? What lines will he cross to make things right? And how far will one man's hatred take him down the path of his own destruction? Stay with us, because this story is just getting started. Hello, friend. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism in all its forms. This channel is a safe space where everyone is valued and respected, regardless of their background or skin color. We believe in the power of stories to shed light on injustice and inspire change. You are not alone in this fight, and your voice matters. Thank you for being here. Now, sit back, and get ready for an incredible story filled with twists, emotion, and justice. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the like button. Your support helps us create more impactful content. Enjoy the story. James Carter was a man who had spent his life defying expectations. Born in the heart of Atlanta to working-class parents, he grew up in a neighborhood where opportunity felt more like a dream than a reality. Yet, James was the kind of child who turned every "no" into fuel for his ambition. His mother, Gloria, worked double shifts as a nurse, and his father, Marvin, a retired Marine, instilled in him a deep sense of discipline and respect for justice. James learned early that the world would not hand him anything, but with effort, strategy, and determination, he could carve out a place for himself. By the time he reached his teenage years, James was already exceptional. His teachers marveled at his intellect, his peers respected his leadership, and his community admired his humility. Despite the challenges that came with being a young black man in America, James never lost sight of his goal, to make a difference. He earned a scholarship to Howard University, where he majored in criminology and later graduated at the top of his class. His passion for justice and fairness was evident in every step he took. James's journey eventually led him to the FBI, where his rise through the ranks was nothing short of extraordinary. While others climbed ladders by blending in, James stood out. He was sharp, composed, and unyielding in his commitment to integrity. By the time he was appointed director of the FBI, he had become a beacon of hope for many and a source of unease for others who resisted change. To those who doubted him, James had one simple response: results. And his results were undeniable. On the other side of this story was Officer Ethan Blake, a man who represented a very different narrative. Ethan was a veteran police officer in his late 40s, a product of a system that often rewarded compliance over introspection. Born and raised in a small town in rural Alabama, Ethan had joined the police force right out of high school. His career had been steady but unremarkable, punctuated by moments of heroism but overshadowed by a pattern of complaints that seemed to go unnoticed, or unaddressed. Ethan wasn't openly malicious, but his worldview was narrow, shaped by years of unchecked biases and a culture that often turned a blind eye to prejudice. Ethan prided himself on being old school. He believed in order and control, often mistaking authority for respect. He saw the world in black and white, both literally and figuratively. In his mind, people who caused trouble deserved whatever consequences came their way. Over the years, this mentality had hardened him, leaving little room for empathy or self-reflection. It was a crisp Monday morning in the suburbs of Arlington, Virginia, where the lives of these two men would intersect. James was on his way to a meeting at the Department of Justice, dressed impeccably in a tailored navy suit that spoke to his meticulous nature. He was the kind of man who believed that appearances mattered, not out of vanity, but because he understood the power of perception. James was always aware that as a black man in a position of authority, he was held to a higher standard, and he met that standard with unwavering precision. Ethan, on the other hand, had started his shift with a sense of irritation. He'd been assigned to patrol the affluent neighborhoods that morning, an area he found boring and uneventful. He preferred being in the thick of things, where he could feel needed, or, as he would put it, where the action is. The mundane nature of his assignment left him restless, and his frustration only grew as the hours dragged on. The intersection where their paths crossed was quiet, framed by manicured lawns and towering oak trees. James was driving his sedan, a sleek vehicle that reflected his success but also his practicality. As he approached a stop sign, Ethan, parked a block away, noticed the car and its driver. Something about the scene didn't sit right with him, though he couldn't articulate why. To Ethan, James's very presence in that neighborhood felt out of place, though he would never admit the bias fueling that thought. Ethan decided to follow the car. When James turned without signaling, a minor oversight that could happen to anyone, Ethan seized the opportunity. He flipped on his lights and pulled James over. From the moment he stepped out of his patrol car, Ethan's posture was combative. He approached James's car with a swagger that spoke more to power than professionalism. James, accustomed to these moments, took a steadying breath before lowering his window. He had dealt with men like Ethan before, people who wielded their authority as a weapon rather than a shield. Still, James remained calm. He reached for his documents, his movements deliberate and non-threatening, aware of how easily things could escalate. "License and registration," Ethan demanded, his tone clipped and impatient. James handed over the documents without hesitation, meeting Ethan's gaze with a quiet confidence that seemed to unnerve the officer. "Is there a problem, officer?" James asked, his voice measured. "You didn't signal when you turned back there," Ethan replied, his eyes scanning James as if searching for a reason to justify his suspicion. James nodded. "I see. My apologies for that oversight." But Ethan wasn't satisfied. There was something about James's composure that irritated him. It was as if James's calm demeanor challenged the very foundation of Ethan's authority. "Step out of the car," Ethan ordered, the words sharp and commanding. James hesitated for a moment, not out of defiance, but because he recognized the crossroads they had arrived at. He knew that complying wouldn't guarantee safety, but resisting could escalate the situation. Choosing the path of least resistance, James stepped out, his movements deliberate and unhurried. As Ethan searched James's car, the tension between them grew thicker. Neighbors began to peek out from their windows, their curiosity piqued by the flashing lights and the escalating scene. Ethan's voice grew louder, more confrontational, as he questioned James about his presence in the neighborhood. "I'm on my way to a meeting," James explained simply, his tone steady. "A meeting?" Ethan scoffed, his skepticism dripping from every word. "In this neighborhood? Dressed like that? Who are you trying to impress?" James took a deep breath, his patience beginning to wane. "Officer, I've complied with your requests. Am I free to go?" Ethan's response was a mocking laugh, followed by a shove that sent James stumbling against the hood of his car. The moment was a flashpoint, a collision of two worlds, one driven by prejudice, the other by dignity. And as James straightened himself, his gaze steady and unyielding, the stage was set for a reckoning that neither man could have anticipated. The days following the traffic stop felt like a slow boil, the tension building in small, almost imperceptible ways. For James Carter, the newly appointed director of the FBI, the incident on the side of that quiet suburban road wasn't something he could simply forget. It lingered in the back of his mind, not because it was new or shocking, James had dealt with prejudice his entire life, but because of the sheer audacity of it. A man in uniform, a supposed protector of justice, had crossed a line so brazenly that it demanded accountability. Yet, James knew this wasn't just about him. It was about the message he could send, not only to the officer who had humiliated him but to a system that allowed such behavior to thrive. Back in his office, surrounded by the imposing grandeur of government authority, James reviewed the footage. It had been sent to him by several bystanders who had witnessed the event, their shaky phone cameras capturing every detail. He watched as Officer Darren Hayes barked orders, as his fist connected with James's jaw, and as the crowd gasped in collective shock. James's own measured response played out on the screen, his composed declaration of identity a stark contrast to the chaos around him. He paused the video and leaned back in his chair, the weight of the decision ahead pressing down on him. The irony wasn't lost on James. He had spent his entire career fighting to ensure accountability within law enforcement, rising through the ranks as a symbol of integrity and resilience. Yet here he was, the director of the FBI, forced to reckon with the very prejudice he had worked so hard to dismantle. He couldn't help but think of his father, a civil rights attorney who had faced countless threats in his fight for justice. James had inherited that same unshakable resolve, but the burden of it weighed heavily on his shoulders. Meanwhile, Darren Hayes was oblivious to the storm brewing around him. A 12-year veteran of the police force, Darren had grown comfortable in his authority, his badge often serving as a shield for his unchecked behavior. To him, the incident on the roadside was just another day. He barely gave it a second thought as he went about his routine, dismissing the whispers among his colleagues and the occasional sideways glances. Darren wasn't the type to apologize, least of all to someone he viewed as beneath him. But the whispers soon turned into murmurs, and the murmurs into open conversations. Word had spread quickly within the precinct, and it wasn't long before Darren was called into the captain's office. The captain, a grizzled man with decades of experience, didn't mince words. He informed Darren that an internal investigation was underway and that he would be placed on administrative leave pending its outcome. Darren bristled at the news, his temper flaring as he protested the decision. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "I was doing my job. That guy was asking for it." The captain's expression hardened. "That guy," he said pointedly, "is James Carter, the director of the FBI. And if you think this is just going to blow over, you're more naive than I thought." Darren left the office in a fury, his mind racing as he tried to process what he'd just heard. The director of the FBI. He replayed the events of that day in his mind, his stomach sinking as the reality of his situation began to set in. But rather than confront his own actions, Darren clung to his anger, convincing himself that he was the victim of an overreaction, a smear campaign orchestrated by a man with an agenda. As the investigation progressed, the divide between Darren's perspective and reality became increasingly stark. Witnesses were interviewed, their accounts painting a damning picture of his behavior. The footage from the incident was submitted as evidence, and its viral spread on social media only added fuel to the fire. Public outcry grew louder with each passing day, calls for Darren's resignation echoing across news outlets and community forums. For James, the unfolding drama was a delicate balancing act. He had the power to dismantle Darren's career with a single phone call, but that wasn't his goal. He didn't just want justice for himself, he wanted to expose the systemic flaws that allowed officers like Darren to act with impunity. It wasn't enough for Darren to face consequences, James needed to ensure that the message reached every corner of the country. Late one night, James sat in his office with a trusted confidant, Special Agent Maria Jenkins. Maria had been with the Bureau for nearly as long as James and had earned his respect through her sharp mind and unwavering commitment to justice. The two of them pored over the evidence, discussing their next steps. "You could press charges," Maria said, her voice measured. "The assault alone is enough to put him behind bars, not to mention the civil rights violations." James nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the files spread across his desk. "I could," he agreed, "but I want this to be about more than one man. Darren Hayes isn't the root of the problem, he's a symptom. If we don't address the disease, another Darren will take his place." Maria leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "So what's the plan?" James's answer came without hesitation. "We make this public. We show the world what happened and let them decide. But we don't stop there. We push for policy changes, mandatory training, accountability measures. This isn't just about Darren Hayes. It's about everyone who thinks they can get away with this." As the pieces of the plan began to fall into place, Darren found himself increasingly isolated. His fellow officers, once quick to back him up, now kept their distance, wary of being associated with his actions. The community he had sworn to protect turned against him, their trust shattered by his blatant abuse of power. Darren's once unshakable confidence began to erode, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. The stage was set, the tension simmering just below the surface. James and Maria worked tirelessly, knowing that the next move would be critical. Public anticipation reached a fever pitch as news of the upcoming press conference spread. Everyone wanted to know what James Carter would say, how he would respond to the officer who had humiliated him so publicly. But as the day of the press conference approached, something unexpected happened, something that would change the course of the story and leave everyone questioning how far one man's pursuit of justice could go. The room buzzed with tension as the press conference began, every seat filled with journalists, community leaders, and members of the public eager to hear James Carter speak. Cameras clicked incessantly, their lenses focused on the podium where the director of the FBI would soon address the nation. The weight of anticipation was palpable, a collective breath held as everyone waited to see how this pivotal moment would unfold. Behind the scenes, James adjusted his tie, his expression calm but intense. Beside him stood Maria Jenkins, a reassuring presence amid the chaos. "You're sure about this?" Maria asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the muffled chatter from the room beyond. James looked at her, his gaze steady. "It's the only way. This isn't about me anymore. It's about everyone who's ever been silenced, humiliated, or made to feel invisible." Maria nodded, her eyes reflecting a mixture of admiration and concern. "Then let's make them listen." As James stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. He stood tall behind the podium, his presence commanding, his eyes scanning the crowd before he began. His voice was firm, measured, and carried the weight of someone who had seen too much but refused to let it break him. "Good afternoon," he started, his gaze steady as it swept across the sea of faces. 2 weeks ago, I was involved in an incident that many of you have seen or heard about. An incident that, unfortunately, is not unique. It is a story that has played out countless times across this country, but this time, it is my story. The room remained silent, the audience hanging on to every word as James recounted the events of that day. He spoke without anger, his tone even, but every word carried the gravity of the truth. He described the traffic stop, the accusations, the assault, and the moments after when he chose to walk away. "I chose not to escalate the situation, not because I was afraid, but because I knew what was at stake. I knew that my actions in that moment would set the tone for everything that followed. And now, here we are." He paused, letting his words settle before continuing. "I have spent my entire career fighting for accountability and justice within law enforcement. I have worked alongside brave men and women who serve with honor and integrity, and I have also encountered those who have abused the power entrusted to them. What happened to me is not an isolated incident. It is a symptom of a deeper issue that we must confront together." As James spoke, Darren Hayes watched from a television in the precinct's break room, his jaw clenched, his expression unreadable. His colleagues avoided him, their eyes flickering with a mixture of pity and disdain. The press conference was everywhere, on every channel, on every screen, and there was no escaping it. Darren felt the walls closing in, the weight of his actions pressing down on him with suffocating force. Back at the conference, James's tone shifted, becoming sharper, more direct. "Accountability is not optional. It is not negotiable. And it starts here, today. I have initiated a full investigation into the events of that day, and the findings will be made public. But this is not just about one officer or one incident. It is about a system that must change. It is about ensuring that no one, regardless of their position, their uniform, or their power, is above the law." The audience erupted into applause, but James raised a hand to quiet them. "This is not the end of the conversation. It is the beginning. And I promise you, we will not stop until justice is served." As the conference concluded, Darren sat alone in the break room, his thoughts racing. The investigation had already uncovered damning evidence, complaints from other officers, a history of misconduct swept under the rug, and the video that had gone viral. He knew his days on the force were numbered, but what terrified him more was the thought of facing James Carter again. Later that evening, Darren received a call summoning him to a meeting at the FBI headquarters. He arrived reluctantly, his nerves frayed as he stepped into the imposing building. He was escorted to a conference room where James and Maria were waiting. The atmosphere was thick with tension as Darren sat across from them, his hands gripping the edges of his chair. James didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Officer Hayes," he began, his voice steady but cold, "do you understand why you're here?" Darren hesitated, his bravado crumbling under James's unwavering gaze. I guess it's about the investigation," he stammered. "It's about accountability," James corrected. "It's about understanding the impact of your actions and taking responsibility for them." Darren shifted uncomfortably, his usual arrogance replaced by a defensive tone. "Look, I know I screwed up, but this whole thing is being blown out of proportion. I was just doing my job." James's expression didn't change, but his voice hardened. "Your job is to serve and protect. Instead, you humiliated and assaulted an innocent man because of your own prejudices. This isn't about a mistake. It's about a pattern of behavior that has no place in law enforcement." The room fell silent, the weight of James's words pressing down on Darren like a physical force. For the first time, Darren looked genuinely shaken, the realization of his actions and their consequences finally sinking in. Maria spoke next, her tone firm but measured. "The investigation has revealed a long history of complaints against you, Officer Hayes. Complaints that were ignored or dismissed because of the culture within your department. That ends now. Effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties, and further legal action is being pursued." Darren's face paled, his hands gripping the chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "You can't do this," he muttered, his voice barely audible. James leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "I already have. This is what accountability looks like. And this is only the beginning." The room was heavy with silence as Darren processed the finality of James's words. His world had crumbled in an instant, and there was no one left to blame but himself. James and Maria stood, signaling the end of the meeting. As they left the room, James turned back one last time, his voice calm but resolute. "I hope you learn from this, Officer Hayes. Because the world is watching, and so am I." Darren was left alone in the sterile conference room, the weight of his actions and their consequences finally sinking in. Outside, James and Maria walked through the bustling halls of the FBI headquarters, their mission far from over but their resolve stronger than ever. As Darren sat in the cold, sterile conference room, his mind churned with conflicting emotions. His initial anger and disbelief had given way to a hollow ache in his chest. He had spent years justifying his actions, hiding behind his badge and the false belief that he was untouchable. Now, stripped of that shield, he was left with nothing but the weight of his own choices. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead lights. For the first time in his life, Darren felt small. Meanwhile, James and Maria walked through the halls of the FBI headquarters, the gravity of the moment settling in. Maria broke the silence first, her voice steady but filled with curiosity. "Do you think he'll learn from this? Or is it just another man trying to dodge accountability?" James didn't answer immediately. His gaze was fixed ahead, his expression unreadable. "People like Darren don't change overnight," he said finally. "But sometimes, when you strip everything away, they're forced to confront who they really are. Whether he learns from it or not is up to him. My job is to make sure he doesn't hurt anyone else." Maria nodded, her respect for James deepening with every word. She had always admired his ability to remain composed under pressure, but moments like this reminded her of the quiet strength that had carried him through years of adversity. "What's the next move?" she asked. James's lips tightened into a thin line. "We keep pushing. This isn't just about Darren Hayes. It's about the culture that allowed him to thrive. The policies, the blind spots, the silence from those who should have spoken up. This is bigger than one man." As they reached James's office, he paused, his hand resting on the door handle. But first, he added, glancing at Maria, we give him a chance to face what he's done. Back in the conference room, Darren's restless thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door opening. James entered, his presence commanding but not overbearing. He carried a file in one hand, its contents thick with evidence, while his expression remained calm yet firm. Darren sat up straighter, his discomfort evident as James took the seat across from him. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The air between them was heavy, the silence charged with unspoken tension. Finally, James broke the quiet, his voice measured but piercing. Do you understand why you're here, Officer Hayes? Darren hesitated, his mind scrambling for the right words. I get it, he muttered, though his tone was unconvincing. You want to make an example out of me. Show everyone what happens when someone screws up. James's eyes narrowed, his patience thinning. This isn't about making an example. This is about accountability. This is about the people who trusted you to protect them and how you betrayed that trust. It's about the man you punched on the side of the road because you couldn't see past the color of his skin. Darren flinched at the bluntness of James's words, his defenses crumbling further. I wasn't thinking, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. It all happened so fast, and James cut him off, his tone sharp but controlled. It didn't happen fast. You had every opportunity to stop yourself, to think, to act with decency. But you didn't. You chose to escalate, to humiliate, to strike. And now you're sitting here because of those choices. Darren's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists on the table. I've been a cop for 12 years, he said defensively. I've seen things you wouldn't believe. People lie, they cheat, they steal. I've had to make split-second decisions to protect myself and others. Maybe I got it wrong this time, but that doesn't mean I'm a bad person. James leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. Being a good person isn't about what you say. It's about what you do. And right now, your actions are telling a story you might not want to hear. The question is, are you willing to listen? Darren stared at James, the weight of his words sinking in. For the first time, he felt a pang of something unfamiliar, guilt. It wasn't a comfortable feeling, but it was impossible to ignore. He looked away, his voice cracking as he spoke. What do you want from me? An apology? A confession? What's the point of all this? James's voice softened, though it still carried the weight of authority. I want you to understand the impact of what you've done. Not just to me, but to every person you've mistreated, every life you've affected with your prejudice and your power. And I want you to take responsibility for it, not because you're being forced to, but because it's the right thing to do. The room fell silent again, the tension between them thick but no longer hostile. Darren's defenses had been chipped away, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. He took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping as he finally met James's gaze. I don't know if I can fix this, he admitted. I don't even know where to start. James nodded, his expression softening slightly. Acknowledging the problem is the first step. But it's not enough. Change takes time, effort, and a willingness to face the uncomfortable truths about yourself. It's not easy, and it's not supposed to be. But if you're serious about making amends, you'll find a way. Darren's eyes flickered with something resembling hope, though it was faint and uncertain. And if I don't? James's gaze hardened once more. Then you'll live with the consequences. Not just from me, but from the people you've hurt and the system that's finally holding you accountable. This is your chance, Darren. Take it, or don't. But know that the choice is yours. As James stood to leave, Darren's voice stopped him. Wait, he said, his tone tentative. Why are you doing this? You could have destroyed me. You still can. So why give me a chance? James turned back, his expression thoughtful. Because accountability isn't about revenge. It's about justice. And justice means giving people the opportunity to change, even when they don't deserve it. With that, James walked out of the room, leaving Darren to sit alone with his thoughts. For the first time, Darren wasn't thinking about how to protect himself or shift the blame. He was thinking about the man he had become, and the man he wanted to be. The echoes of their conversation lingered in Darren's mind long after James left the room. The gravity of those final words, justice means giving people the opportunity to change, repeated in a loop, cutting deeper each time. For a man who had spent his career avoiding introspection, the sudden demand for it was almost unbearable. He sat there, motionless, staring at the empty chair across from him, the silence of the room pressing against him like a physical weight. The walk to his car felt longer than usual. Each step felt heavier, his polished shoes clicking against the tile floor, echoing down the long corridor of the FBI building. His mind raced with questions he didn't know how to answer. What if he couldn't change? What if it was too late? He passed by people who avoided his gaze, their silence louder than any confrontation could have been. By the time he reached his car, he felt like a ghost, visible but not acknowledged. Later that evening, Darren found himself sitting in his dimly lit living room, a beer sweating in his hand, the television casting shadows on the walls. The news was on, and James Carter's press conference was being replayed. Darren couldn't bring himself to turn it off. He watched as James stood there, calm and resolute, his words cutting through the static in Darren's mind. This is not just about one man. It is about a system that must change. Those words echoed like a verdict. Darren had always thought of himself as part of the system, a cog in the machine, but now he realized he had become a symbol of everything wrong with it. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his hands clutching his head. He didn't know how to process the storm of emotions crashing over him, shame, guilt, anger, and something else he couldn't quite name. Regret, maybe. Or fear. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling him out of his spiral. He picked it up hesitantly and saw an unfamiliar number. For a moment, he considered ignoring it, but something compelled him to answer. Hello. The voice on the other end was steady but cautious. Officer Hayes. This is Maria Jenkins. Special agent with the FBI. Darren's stomach tightened. Yeah, I remember you, he said, his voice tinged with apprehension. What's this about? Maria didn't mince words. Director Carter asked me to follow up with you. He wanted to make sure you understood the next steps. Darren's throat felt dry. Next steps, he repeated, his voice hollow. I thought it was over. Maria's tone softened slightly, but it didn't lose its edge. The investigation into your actions is over, but your journey isn't. Director Carter believes in giving people the opportunity to make amends, but it's up to you to take it. Darren hesitated, unsure of how to respond. And what exactly does that mean? It means we're offering you a chance to participate in a community outreach program, Maria explained. You'll work with people who've been directly impacted by police misconduct. You'll hear their stories, see the consequences of actions like yours, and maybe start to understand the bigger picture. Darren's first instinct was to reject the idea outright. The thought of sitting in a room full of people who would look at him with disdain, who would blame him for things he couldn't control, made his skin crawl. But beneath that instinct was a flicker of something else, curiosity, maybe even a desire to understand. I'll think about it, he said finally, his voice lacking conviction. Maria's response was measured but firm. Don't just think about it, Officer Hayes. Do it. You've been given a second chance. Don't waste it. After the call ended, Darren sat in the silence of his living room, the weight of Maria's words settling over him. A second chance. The idea felt foreign to him, almost undeserved, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized he didn't want to go back to the man he was before. He didn't want to be defined by his mistakes, but he knew he couldn't erase them either. A week later, Darren found himself in a small community center on the edge of town, seated in a circle of folding chairs. The room was modest, its walls lined with posters promoting equality and justice. Around him sat men and women of different ages and backgrounds, their expressions a mix of curiosity and skepticism. At the front of the room stood a man in his late 60s, his weathered face marked by years of activism. "Welcome," the man said, his voice warm but firm. "This is a space for truth, accountability, and growth. No one here is perfect, but we're all here to learn." Darren shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He felt the weight of every gaze in the room, the unspoken judgments pressing against him. The man at the front of the room continued, his tone steady and calm. "We're going to start by sharing stories," he said. "Not to assign blame, but to understand. Understanding is the first step toward change." As the session progressed, Darren listened as one by one, people shared their experiences. A young woman spoke about her brother, who had been wrongfully arrested and whose life had been forever altered by a false accusation. An older man recounted the fear he felt every time he was pulled over, the way his hands would shake as he tried to prove he wasn't a threat. Their stories were raw, painful, and deeply human. When it was Darren's turn to speak, he hesitated. The room was silent, every eye on him, waiting. He took a deep breath, his voice shaky as he began. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "I've made mistakes. I've hurt people. And for a long time, I didn't think about the consequences of my actions. I thought I was doing my job, but I see now that I wasn't. Not really." His words hung in the air, the vulnerability in his voice surprising even himself. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the people who had shared their pain, and for the first time, he didn't feel defensive. He felt ashamed. "I don't expect forgiveness," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I want to understand. I want to do better." The man at the front of the room nodded, his expression kind but serious. "Understanding is a good start," he said. "But it's just the beginning." As the session ended, Darren left the community center feeling lighter than he had in weeks. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was a step in the right direction. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was moving towards something better. The weeks that followed Darren's first session at the community center were a blur of raw emotions and hard realizations. Each meeting was like peeling back another layer of himself, exposing wounds he didn't even know he had. The stories he heard from the people in that circle stayed with him long after he left, echoing in his mind as he drove home, as he tried to sleep, as he faced his own reflection in the mirror. Every tale of fear, pain, and loss was a mirror held up to his actions, and he hated the man he saw in its reflection. One evening, Darren arrived at the community center to find the usual circle of chairs already filled with familiar faces. Among them was James Carter, sitting calmly with his hands resting lightly on his knees. Darren froze in the doorway, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't expected this. James had never attended any of the sessions before, and seeing him there now felt like a test he wasn't sure he was ready for. "Have a seat, Darren," the group leader said gently, gesturing to the one empty chair directly across from James. Darren hesitated for a moment before stepping forward, his movement stiff and awkward as he lowered himself into the chair. James's expression was unreadable, his gaze steady but not hostile. The room fell silent as the group leader addressed them. "Tonight, we're going to talk about forgiveness," he said, his voice calm but purposeful. "Not as something that's owed, but as something that can help us heal. Forgiveness doesn't erase what's happened, but it can be a step toward understanding. And understanding is what we're here for." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Darren glanced at James, his throat dry, but James gave no indication of what he was thinking. The group leader turned to Darren, his tone kind but firm. "Darren, would you like to start?" Darren swallowed hard, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, but none was heavier than James's. "I don't know if I deserve forgiveness," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've done things I'm not proud of, and I've hurt people in ways I can't take back. I used to think I was just doing my job, but now I see that I was wrong. I see the damage I've caused." He paused, his chest tightening as he fought to find the right words. "I don't expect anyone here to forgive me. I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. But I'm here because I want to understand. I want to be better. And if there's any way I can make amends, I want to try." The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of Darren's confession settling over the group. Finally, James spoke, his voice calm but with an edge that commanded attention. "Understanding is a start," James said, his gaze locked on Darren. "But it's not enough. Understanding doesn't erase the fear someone feels when they see a police car in their rearview mirror. It doesn't undo the pain of being treated like less than human. And it doesn't change what you've done." Darren nodded, his shoulders slumping under the weight of James's words. "I know," he said softly. "I can't change the past, but I want to do better in the future. I don't want to be that person anymore." James studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned forward, his voice lowering but losing none of its intensity. "You want to make amends? Then listen. Really listen. Not just to the stories in this room, but to the ones outside of it. Listen to the people who are too afraid to speak up, the ones who've given up hope that things will ever change. And then use what you hear to change the way you think, the way you act, the way you live. That's the only way forward." The honesty in James's words cut through Darren like a blade, but there was something else there too, a flicker of hope. Darren nodded slowly, his voice steady as he replied. "I will. I promise." For the rest of the session, Darren listened intently as others shared their experiences with forgiveness, both giving and receiving it. Each story was a reminder of the complexity of the journey he was on, the difficult but necessary steps he had to take to move forward. And through it all, James remained calm and composed, his presence a constant reminder of what Darren was working toward. After the session ended, Darren lingered near the door, watching as James spoke with the group leader. He debated whether to approach him, unsure if he had the right words or if James would even want to hear them. But before he could decide, James turned and caught his eye. "Walk with me," James said simply, his tone leaving no room for argument. Darren followed him outside, the cool night air a stark contrast to the warmth of the room they had just left. They walked in silence for a while, the sound of their footsteps the only noise breaking the stillness. Finally, Darren spoke, his voice hesitant. "I wasn't sure if you'd ever want to talk to me again." James glanced at him, his expression thoughtful. "This isn't about what I want. It's about what needs to be done." Darren nodded, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "I meant what I said in there. I want to make things right, but I don't know how." James stopped walking and turned to face him, his gaze piercing. "You start by owning your actions, every single one of them. No excuses, no justifications. You own them, and then you work every day to do better. Not for me, not for anyone else, but because it's the right thing to do." Darren met his gaze, the sincerity in James's words hitting him like a wave. "I will," he said quietly. "I don't know how long it'll take, but I'll keep trying." James studied him for a moment before nodding. "Good. But remember, this isn't about redemption. It's about accountability. Redemption is a byproduct of accountability, not the goal." As they parted ways, Darren felt a strange mix of emotions, fear, hope, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was heading in the right direction. And that, he realized, was the only way forward. Months later, the world had shifted for both James Carter and Darren Hayes, though in vastly different ways. For James, the ripple effects of that one traffic stop had transformed into a national movement. Policies were being re-examined, and departments across the country had begun adopting reforms inspired by the public reckoning his experience had ignited. It wasn't a victory, not yet. James knew change was slow and often met with resistance, but the seeds had been planted. And, most importantly, people were finally listening. He had faced the storm head-on and emerged as a stronger leader, not just for his position but for what he represented to so many people who saw themselves in his story. Darren's path was different, one marked by a painful and ongoing process of self-discovery and accountability. He had resigned from the police force, a decision he initially fought but later realized was necessary. It was a quiet resignation, without the ceremony or camaraderie that often accompanied such farewells. For Darren, the badge had become a symbol of everything he needed to leave behind. The community outreach program he'd begrudgingly joined had become a lifeline, offering him a chance to understand the depth of the harm he had caused and, more importantly, how to rebuild himself from the ground up. One night, after a particularly emotional session at the community center, Darren lingered to speak with the group leader. His voice was quiet but firm, carrying a sense of purpose that had been absent for years. "I want to do more," he said. "Listening isn't enough. I want to help." The leader regarded him carefully before nodding. "Then use what you've learned. Start where you are, and do the work." Darren took those words to heart. Over time, he began volunteering with organizations focused on rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. He spoke openly about his past mistakes, not as a way to absolve himself but to serve as a cautionary tale. It wasn't easy, many people refused to forgive him, and some openly questioned his motives, but Darren accepted their anger as part of the process. Slowly, he started to feel something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. Months turned into a year, and one day, Darren found himself standing outside the FBI headquarters once more. This time, it wasn't under duress or as part of a summons. He had requested a meeting with James Carter, unsure if it would even be granted. To his surprise, James agreed, and now Darren stood in the same hallway where his life had unraveled. When James entered the room, his expression was neutral, his posture relaxed but commanding. "I didn't think I'd see you again," James said, his tone devoid of judgment but carrying a weight that made Darren feel small. "I wasn't sure if you'd agree to this," Darren admitted, his voice steady but tinged with nervousness. James motioned for Darren to sit, and the two men faced each other across the table. For a moment, neither spoke, the silence between them heavy with unspoken history. Finally, Darren broke the silence. "I came here to thank you," he said. "Not just for what you did that day, but for everything after. You didn't have to give me a second chance, but you did, and it changed my life. I'm not asking for forgiveness because I know I don't deserve it, but I wanted you to know that I'm trying. I'm doing the work." James listened intently, his expression unreadable. When Darren finished, James leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "The work isn't about me," he said. "It's about the people you hurt, the trust you broke, and the system you were a part of. If you're doing the work, then do it for them." Darren nodded, his eyes reflecting a mixture of humility and determination. "I will." As Darren stood to leave, James spoke again, his voice softer this time. "Change is hard. It's uncomfortable. But if you're serious about it, keep going. And remember, it's not about erasing the past, it's about building a better future." Darren left the building feeling lighter, as though a part of the burden he carried had been lifted. He knew his journey was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. For James, the encounter was a reminder of why he had taken the approach he did. Justice wasn't about vengeance, it was about transformation, about creating opportunities for growth even in the most unlikely places. That belief had carried him through his career, and it would continue to guide him as he worked to create systemic change from the inside out. As for the broader impact, the reforms James championed began to take root. Training programs emphasizing de-escalation and empathy were implemented nationwide, and communities began to see tangible changes in how law enforcement operated. It was far from perfect, and setbacks were inevitable, but the momentum was undeniable. James knew the work would outlive him, and that was exactly as it should be. Now, let's take a moment to reflect. This story wasn't just about a man who abused his power or another who held him accountable. It was about the power of choice. Every single one of us has the ability to make choices that either perpetuate harm or pave the way for healing. Darren Hayes made choices that caused pain and destruction, but when given the opportunity to change, he chose a different path. James Carter made choices rooted in integrity and justice, even when it would have been easier to act out of anger. What choices are you making in your life? Are they building bridges or burning them? Are they leaving the world a little better than you found it? If this story moved you, if it made you think or feel something, let us know in the comments. What would you have done in Darren's place? In James's? We'd love to hear your thoughts. And before you go, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories like this, stories that challenge, inspire, and leave you questioning what's next. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and join us next time for another tale that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you soon.